The morning air was crisp and cool as Marcus Johnson walked through the bustling airport terminal. The sound of rolling suitcases and distant announcements filled the space, blending into the hum of travelers heading to their destinations. Marcus moved with purpose, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure as he navigated the crowd. He had been up since dawn, grabbing a quick coffee before boarding his flight from Chicago to New York. It wasn't just any trip. It was for a work conference, one that promised both professional growth and a rare chance to unwind. As Marcus approached the gate, he glanced at his ticket. First class. After months of long hours and demanding cases, he figured he deserved a little comfort. The line to board began to move, and soon he was stepping onto the plane, greeted by the familiar smile of a flight attendant. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly as he handed over his boarding pass. Marcus returned the smile and made his way down the narrow aisle, scanning for his seat. His spot was near the front, an aisle seat that would make it easier to stretch his legs during the 3-hour flight. As he slid his carry-on into the overhead compartment, he noticed the man sitting across the row. Middle-aged, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, the man had an air of arrogance about him. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Marcus almost immediately, and there was something in his expression, something sharp and unwelcoming, that gave Marcus pause. For a moment, their eyes met. Marcus didn't flinch. Years of working in high-pressure situations had taught him how to read people quickly, and this man's demeanor screamed entitlement. Still, Marcus wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Maybe the guy was just having a bad day. Shrugging it off, Marcus settled into his seat, pulling out the novel he'd been meaning to finish. The book was a thriller, gripping enough to help him tune out the world around him. But tuning out wasn't going to be easy. Across the aisle, the man continued to stare, his gaze heavy with judgment. At first, Marcus thought he might be imagining things. After all, flights were crowded, and people often looked around absent-mindedly. But this felt different. The intensity of the man's glare was impossible to ignore. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, pretending to focus on his book while keeping one ear open to the murmurs around him. The plane wasn't full yet, but already the energy felt tense. A mother tried to calm her restless toddler a few rows back, and a businessman tapped impatiently on his laptop nearby. Yet none of these sounds distracted Marcus as much as the weight of the man's stare. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. Glancing over, Marcus caught the man glaring again, his lips pressed into a thin line. This time, Marcus raised an eyebrow, silently challenging him to say something. The man didn't speak, but his body language said plenty. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. For a brief second, Marcus considered addressing the situation head-on, but he decided against it. There was no point in starting trouble before the flight even took off. Instead, he leaned back, flipping a page in his book. Whatever this man's problem was, Marcus wasn't going to let it ruin his day. Little did he know, the real drama was only beginning. As the plane's engines roared to life, signaling the start of their journey, Marcus tried to focus on his book. The tension in the air, however, made it hard to concentrate. Across the aisle, the man who had been glaring at him earlier began shifting restlessly in his seat. At first, Marcus thought nothing of it. People often got anxious during takeoff. But then he heard it, a muttered comment, barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Can't believe they let just anyone sit up here," the man said under his breath, his tone dripping with disdain. Marcus stiffened, his fingers tightening around the edges of his book. He didn't need to look up to know the words were directed at him. Still, he chose not to react. Years of experience as an FBI agent had taught him the value of patience and restraint. Sometimes, silence was the best weapon. But the man wasn't done. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, he leaned forward slightly, speaking louder this time. People like him shouldn't even be allowed in first class. They're probably just taking up space. His voice carried just enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few heads turned, curious about the source of the disturbance. Marcus felt the weight of those glances, but kept his eyes fixed on the page in front of him, pretending to read. The comments stung, but Marcus refused to give the man the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Instead, he took a deep breath, reminding himself that ignorance wasn't worth his energy. That didn't stop the man from continuing his tirade, though. After a few moments of awkward silence, he cleared his throat loudly before adding, "You'd think they'd screen people better." This time, Marcus couldn't ignore it. Slowly, he lowered his book and turned to face the man, his expression calm but firm. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice steady and measured. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" The man hesitated, caught off guard by Marcus's composure. For a second, it seemed like he might back down. But instead, he straightened up, puffing out his chest as if preparing for battle. "I'm just saying," he replied, his tone laced with false politeness. "You don't exactly look like someone who belongs here." "No offense, of course." "No offense," Marcus repeated, raising an eyebrow. "None taken, I suppose. But since we're being honest, maybe you should explain what belonging looks like to you." The man faltered, clearly unprepared for such a direct response. Before he could recover, a flight attendant approached. Her smile strained as she addressed the growing tension. "Is everything okay here, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus nodded politely. "Everything's fine," he assured her, his tone smooth and reassuring. "Just having a conversation." The man across the aisle, however, wasn't ready to let it go. Leaning toward the flight attendant, he gestured vaguely in Marcus's direction. "Actually, I do have a concern," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This guy, well, he makes me uncomfortable. Something about him just doesn't seem right." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unwarranted. Marcus felt a flicker of anger, but quickly pushed it aside. He dealt with worse insults in his line of work, and he knew better than to let emotions cloud his judgment. Instead, he met the man's gaze head-on, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry to hear that," Marcus said coolly. "But unless you have a specific reason for your discomfort, I suggest we both try to enjoy the flight." The flight attendant, sensing the escalating tension, stepped in again. "Sir, unless there's a legitimate safety issue, we can't ask anyone to move or leave the flight," she explained gently, though her tone carried a hint of warning. The man frowned, clearly frustrated that his complaints weren't getting the reaction he wanted. For a moment, the cabin fell silent, the other passengers watching nervously as the standoff continued. Some seemed sympathetic to Marcus, while others appeared uneasy, unsure of how to respond. But one thing was clear: the man's behavior was crossing a line, and everyone could feel it. Unbeknownst to him, his actions were setting the stage for a confrontation he would soon regret. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg, whose name Marcus had overheard when the flight attendant addressed him, wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the attention his complaints were drawing. His face flushed red as he leaned further into the aisle, his voice growing louder with each passing second. "This isn't about comfort," Greg snapped, glaring at Marcus. "It's about safety. You can't just ignore someone who looks suspicious." He waved a hand dismissively toward Marcus, as if trying to justify his words without actually saying them out loud. The implication was clear. Marcus didn't belong here because of the color of his skin. The flight attendant, now visibly uneasy, glanced between the two men. Her smile wavered under the weight of the situation. "Sir," she began cautiously, her tone firmer this time, "we don't profile passengers. Everyone on this flight has gone through security checks and is cleared to travel. Unless there's a specific threat or issue you can point to, I'm afraid we can't act on assumptions." Greg scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Assumptions? Are you serious? Look at him." He jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction, his voice rising to a near shout. "Doesn't that seem off to anyone else?" Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, His mind raced. He'd faced discrimination before, both in his personal life and during his career as an FBI agent, but it never failed to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. What frustrated him most wasn't the insult, it was the ignorance behind it. People like Greg operated from fear and prejudice, clinging to stereotypes instead of facts. Still, Marcus knew better than to let anger dictate his response. "Excuse me," Marcus said evenly, leaning forward slightly so the entire row could hear him. "If you're accusing me of something, I'd appreciate it if you said it outright. Otherwise, maybe we should all focus on getting through this flight peacefully." His words hit their mark. For a moment, Greg looked flustered, caught off guard by Marcus's composure, but rather than backpedal, he doubled down, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying your presence makes people uncomfortable. Maybe you should consider moving somewhere else where no one will have a problem." A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others shifted awkwardly in their seats. One woman sitting nearby rolled her eyes subtly, clearly unimpressed by Greg's behavior. Another man shook his head almost imperceptibly, muttering something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "What a jerk." The flight attendant, sensing the situation spiraling, stepped closer to Greg. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but unless there's a valid reason for action, we can't ask any passenger to relocate. This is a public flight, and everyone has the right to be here." Greg bristled at her response, his frustration boiling over. Public flight. Right, sure. Because obviously, everyone deserves to sit in first class. His sarcasm dripped with venom, making it impossible to miss his underlying meaning. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. "Funny," he said dryly. "I thought paying for a ticket was how you earned the right to sit anywhere." The retort drew a few quiet chuckles from nearby passengers, much to Greg's dismay. He shot them a glare before turning back to the flight attendant, his patience wearing thin. "Fine," he huffed, throwing up his hands. "But if something happens, don't say I didn't warn you." The comment hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Marcus felt the weight of it, but refused to let it shake him. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, adopting an air of quiet confidence that only fueled Greg's irritation. The message was clear. Whatever Greg threw at him next, Marcus wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't intimidated. For a brief moment, the cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Passengers exchanged wary glances, unsure of what might come next. Meanwhile, Greg fumed silently, his jaw clenched tight as he stared daggers at Marcus. Little did he know, the real fireworks were yet to come. Greg's frustration reached a boiling point. He couldn't believe that no one, neither the flight attendant nor the other passengers, was siding with him. His face was red, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. But instead of calming down, he became even more agitated, his voice rising louder than before. "This is ridiculous," Greg barked, jabbing a finger toward Marcus again. "You're telling me you're just going to ignore this? What if he's dangerous? What if something happens mid-flight? Then what?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor only fueling Greg's anger. "Dangerous?" Marcus repeated, his tone laced with quiet skepticism. "Based on what? The fact that I'm sitting here reading a book, or is it because of how I look?" Greg hesitated for a split second, caught off guard by the directness of the question. But rather than back down, he doubled down, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's not play games here," he snapped. "People like you. You know exactly what I mean. You don't belong in first class. You stick out like a sore thumb." The cabin went silent. Even the faint hum of the plane's engines seemed to fade into the background as Greg's words hung in the air. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others shifted awkwardly in their seats. One elderly woman seated behind Greg shook her head disapprovingly, muttering under her breath about rudeness and bad manners. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp and focused. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly, his voice perfectly measured. "You think I'm suspicious, not because of anything I've done, but because of who I am." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a brief moment, he looked unsure, as if realizing for the first time how absurd his argument sounded. But then his pride kicked in, and he blurted out, "It's not about who you are, it's about what you represent." "And what exactly do I represent?" Marcus asked, his tone still calm but now carrying a subtle edge. Greg faltered, stammering as he tried to find the right words. You represent, well, you know." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without sounding completely ridiculous, or worse, openly racist. The flight attendant, sensing the tension reaching a breaking point, stepped in once again. "Sir, please," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We cannot remove a passenger unless there's a legitimate reason. Harassment or discrimination won't be tolerated on this flight." Greg's jaw dropped at her rebuke. "Harassment? Discrimination? Are you kidding me? Now I'm the bad guy here." Before the flight attendant could respond, Marcus spoke up, his voice steady and commanding. "No one's calling you the bad guy," he said, meeting Greg's gaze directly. "But maybe you should ask yourself why you're so quick to judge someone based on nothing more than appearances." Greg sputtered, clearly struggling to defend his position. "I'm not judging anyone. I'm just saying." "You're just saying what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharper now. "That people who look like me don't deserve to sit in first class. That we're automatically suspicious. That's not judgment, that's prejudice." The word landed like a punch, silencing Greg instantly. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely shaken. His earlier bravado crumbled, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and panic. He glanced around the cabin, searching for support, but found none. The other passengers avoided his gaze, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others looking outright disgusted. Realizing he'd lost control of the situation, Greg made one last desperate attempt to save face. "Fine," he spat, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Do whatever you want, but when something goes wrong, don't come crying to me." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. The cabin remained eerily quiet, the weight of the confrontation settling over everyone like a thick fog. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Greg's hostility had been exposed for what it truly was, baseless prejudice masked as concern. And while Greg stewed in his own discomfort, Marcus knew the real truth would soon come to light, in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a heavy silence blanketing the rows of passengers as Greg sat fuming in his seat. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Marcus, on the other hand, remained composed, leaning back against his seat with an air of quiet confidence that only seemed to infuriate Greg further. For a moment, it felt like the confrontation had reached its peak, like nothing more could be said or done to escalate things. But Marcus knew better. He'd spent years honing his ability to read people, to spot the cracks in their facades, and he could see that Greg was teetering on the edge of losing control entirely. The man's desperation was evident in the way he shifted uncomfortably, glancing around for validation that never came. Deciding enough was enough, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "You know," he began, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. "This whole thing could have been avoided if you just kept your opinions to yourself." Greg's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing at the challenge. "My opinions," he shot back, his voice rising again despite his earlier promise to stay quiet. "I'm not the one acting suspicious here." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his bag, pulling out a sleek black folder. He opened it casually, revealing a badge inside. a badge that gleamed under the soft cabin lights. Without saying a word, he held it up so Greg could see it clearly. Time seemed to freeze. Greg's mouth dropped open, his face going pale as he stared at the FBI insignia emblazoned on the badge. For several long seconds, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. It was as though all the air had been sucked out of the plane. Around them, the other passengers craned their necks to get a better look, whispers rippling through the cabin as they realized what was happening. "You think I'm suspicious?" Marcus finally spoke, his tone dripping with quiet authority. "Let me tell you something. I've spent my career dealing with real threats, real danger. And trust me, none of those people looked remotely like me, or you, for that matter." Greg stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating instantly. I didn't. I mean, words failed him as he struggled to process the situation. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the polished professional sitting across from him with the prejudiced image he'd constructed in his head. Marcus let the silence stretch for a beat before continuing, his voice steady and unyielding. "What you did today, that wasn't about safety. That was about bias, about assuming the worst based on nothing more than skin color. And guess what? You picked the wrong guy to mess with." By now, the entire cabin was watching intently, some passengers openly gawking while others exchanged knowing looks. One woman seated nearby gave Marcus a subtle thumbs up, her expression a mix of admiration and relief. Even the flight attendant, who had been standing nearby observing the exchange, looked visibly impressed, her earlier anxiety replaced by quiet satisfaction. Greg, meanwhile, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His shoulders slumped, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried, and failed, to form a coherent sentence. "Look, I didn't know," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought." "You thought wrong." Marcus cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And next time, maybe think twice before accusing someone of being dangerous just because of how they look." Greg nodded weakly, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. The fight had drained out of him completely, leaving behind only shame and regret. He sank deeper into his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially the curious stares of his fellow passengers. As the reality of the situation settled over the cabin, Marcus tucked the badge back into his bag and leaned back in his seat once more. The confrontation was over, but its impact lingered in the air. For Greg, it was a harsh lesson in humility and accountability. For everyone else, it was a powerful reminder of the harm caused by prejudice and the importance of standing firm against it. The cabin was eerily quiet after Marcus put his badge away, the weight of the moment settling over everyone like a thick fog. Greg sat slumped in his seat, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The confident, entitled businessman who had strutted onto the plane earlier was gone, replaced by a man drowning in embarrassment and regret. Marcus, on the other hand, exuded calm authority. He leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed but commanding, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Greg was too humiliated to say anything, and the other passengers seemed unsure whether to applaud or simply stay silent. Even the flight attendant hesitated before stepping forward again, her professional smile returning as she tried to diffuse the lingering tension. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, sir?" she asked Greg gently, though her tone carried an unmistakable note of finality. It wasn't really a question. It was a polite way of telling him the matter was closed. Greg shook his head quickly, avoiding eye contact. No, that's fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. But there was no escape, not from the stares of the surrounding passengers, not from the reality of what had just happened. Marcus broke the silence first, addressing Greg directly, but without malice. "Let me ask you something," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough edge to command attention. "Do you feel safer now? Did accusing me of being suspicious make this flight any less dangerous?" Greg flinched at the question, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find words. I didn't mean," he started, trailing off when he realized how hollow his excuses sounded. Instead, he settled for shaking his head, his shame evident in every line of his body. "That's what I thought," Marcus continued, his tone firm but measured. "Prejudice doesn't keep anyone safe. It creates problems where none exist. You judged me based on how I look, not on what I've done, or who I am. And that kind of thinking, it hurts people. It divides us. It makes situations like this one unnecessary." His words resonated throughout the cabin, drawing murmurs of agreement from several passengers. One older man seated nearby nodded approvingly, while a young woman whispered to her companion, "He's absolutely right." Even the flight attendant gave Marcus a small, respectful smile before retreating down the aisle to tend to other passengers. Greg shifted uneasily, clearly desperate to change the subject, or better yet, erase the entire incident from existence. "Look," he stammered, forcing himself to look at Marcus for the first time since the badge reveal. "I'm sorry, okay? I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said those things." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly but still guarded. "Apologies are good," he replied evenly, "but they're only meaningful if you learn from them. Next time, don't let your assumptions get the best of you. They don't just hurt others. They make you look bad, too." The comment drew a few quiet chuckles from nearby passengers, breaking some of the tension in the air. Greg winced, but didn't argue. He knew Marcus was right. Defeated, he sank deeper into his seat, staring out the window as if hoping the clouds outside could swallow him whole. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere on the plane slowly began to shift. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the hum of the engines once again became the dominant sound. Some passengers shot Marcus admiring glances, silently thanking him for handling the situation with such poise and professionalism. Others exchanged knowing looks, their shared experience bonding them in subtle ways. For Marcus, the confrontation was already fading into the background. He picked up his book, flipping to the page he'd been reading before the drama unfolded. Outwardly, he appeared unfazed, but inwardly, he felt a familiar ache, the exhaustion that came with constantly having to prove himself in a world quick to judge him based on appearances. Still, moments like this reminded him why he chose his career path: to fight against ignorance and injustice, even in small, everyday battles. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Greg remained silent, his earlier arrogance replaced by a profound sense of humility. Meanwhile, Marcus read his book, his steady presence serving as a quiet reminder that dignity and resilience could triumph over prejudice, even at 35,000 feet. As the plane cruised steadily through the clouds, the initial shock of the confrontation began to fade. The cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Flight attendants moved down the aisles offering drinks and snacks, passengers chatted quietly, and the soft hum of the engines filled the background. But the tension from earlier lingered in subtle ways, like an undercurrent that couldn't quite be ignored. Greg remained slouched in his seat, staring blankly out the window as if trying to disappear into the endless expanse of blue sky. Occasionally, he'd glance furtively at Marcus, only to look away quickly when their eyes met. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to shrink smaller with each passing minute. Every time someone nearby whispered or chuckled softly, Greg flinched, convinced they were talking about him. And he wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, Marcus appeared unfazed, flipping through the pages of his book with quiet focus. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he had already moved on from the incident. But beneath his calm exterior, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. Frustration at yet another reminder of how prejudice followed him everywhere. Pride in standing up for himself without losing his composure, and a deep weariness from carrying the weight of such encounters throughout his life. Eventually, the flight crew stepped in to address the situation formally. A senior flight attendant approached Marcus's row, her demeanor professional but warm. "Sir," she said, addressing Marcus directly, "we wanted to thank you for handling that so gracefully. We take these matters very seriously, and will ensure this is documented appropriately." Marcus nodded politely, appreciating her effort. "I understand," he replied, his tone measured. "I don't want to make a scene, but I think it's important that incidents like this are recorded. It's not just about me. It's about setting an example for how we treat each other." The flight attendant gave him a small, grateful smile before turning her attention to Greg. Her expression softened slightly, though her voice carried a hint of authority. "Sir, while we respect your right to voice concerns during a flight, accusations based on bias or discrimination won't be tolerated. We'll need to include this in our report once we land." Greg swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. "Understood," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. He knew there was no point in arguing further. The damage was done, and everyone on the plane, from the flight crew to the passengers, had witnessed his behavior. Once the flight attendant left, Greg buried his face in his hands, his shoulders sagging with defeat. For the first time, he seemed genuinely remorseful, though whether it stemmed from guilt or fear of consequences was unclear. Either way, the transformation was striking. The man who had strutted onto the plane full of arrogance now looked like a shadow of his former self. Around them, the mood among the passengers shifted subtly. Some openly praised Marcus under their breath, calling him classy and professional. Others shared stories of similar experiences, bonding over their mutual disdain for prejudice. One middle-aged woman leaned across the aisle to whisper to Marcus, "Thank you for standing up to him. People like that need to be called out." Marcus offered her a polite smile, acknowledging the sentiment without seeking validation. "It's not easy," he admitted softly, "but staying calm makes all the difference." By the time the plane began its descent toward New York, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The earlier hostility was replaced by a sense of quiet solidarity. Passengers exchanged nods and smiles, united by the shared experience of witnessing justice served, not through anger, but through dignity and truth. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, there was a noticeable pause as people gathered their belongings. As Marcus stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment, several passengers stopped to thank him personally. "You handled that beautifully," one man said sincerely. Another simply shook his hand, saying nothing but conveying everything with a respectful nod. Greg, meanwhile, shuffled off the plane as quickly as possible, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Whether he learned a lasting lesson from the encounter remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Marcus's actions left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed them. As Marcus stepped into the terminal, he took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of relief that came with leaving a tense situation behind. Yet he also carried a renewed sense of purpose. Moments like this reminded him why his work mattered, not just in fighting crime, but in challenging ignorance wherever it arose. And as he walked away, the ripple effects of what had happened on the plane continued to spread, sparking conversations. The wheels of the plane screeched against the tarmac as Marcus stepped off the aircraft and into the bustling terminal. The bright lights and steady hum of travelers moving in every direction provided a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere he'd just left behind. For a moment, he paused at the gate, taking the deep breath to center himself before heading toward baggage claim. Despite the confrontation on the flight, he felt a strange sense of clarity, a reminder that moments like these were opportunities to challenge ignorance and inspire change. As he made his way through the crowded airport, Marcus reflected on what had happened. He knew incidents like this weren't uncommon for people who looked like him. Whether it was being followed in a store, questioned at work, or judged on a plane, prejudice wasn't something he could easily escape. But each encounter also reinforced why he chose his path in life, to fight for fairness, justice, and equality. This time, though, there was a silver lining. He hadn't let anger dictate his response. Instead, he'd stayed calm, used his position to make a statement, and turned an uncomfortable situation into a teachable moment. For Greg, for the passengers, and perhaps even for himself. By the time Marcus reached the baggage carousel, word of the incident had spread. A few passengers from the flight recognized him and nodded respectfully as they passed by. One woman approached him hesitantly, her eyes warm with admiration. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "What you did back there, it meant a lot. Not many people would have handled it so well." Marcus gave her a small smile, touched by her words. "It's not about me," he replied modestly. "It's about standing up for what's right. We all have a responsibility to call out bias when we see it." The woman nodded thoughtfully before walking away, leaving Marcus to collect his bag. As he waited, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a notification from social media, an alert about a post going viral. Curious, he opened the app and scrolled through the comments. To his surprise, several passengers had taken to Twitter and Instagram to share their accounts of the confrontation. Videos captured snippets of Greg's tirade and Marcus's composed rebuttal, along with captions praising his professionalism and poise. "FBI agent shuts down racist passenger mid-flight," one headline read. "A lesson in grace under pressure," another declared. The posts were accompanied by photos of Marcus holding his badge, which someone had discreetly snapped during the reveal. Comments poured in from across the country, with users applauding his handling of the situation and condemning Greg's behavior. Within hours, the story had gained traction, sparking conversations about racial bias, privilege, and accountability. Back at his hotel later that evening, Marcus sat by the window overlooking the New York skyline. The city buzzed with energy below, its lights twinkling like stars against the night. He scrolled through the news coverage, reading article after article detailing the incident. Some outlets focused on the viral nature of the story, while others highlighted the broader implications of prejudice in everyday settings. Reporters reached out to the airline for comment, prompting them to issue a public statement reaffirming their zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination. Though Marcus wasn't seeking attention, he couldn't deny the impact the incident had created. It served as a powerful reminder that even seemingly small acts of resistance could ripple outward, inspiring others to speak up and take action. He thought about Greg, how the man's assumptions had cost him not only his dignity, but also a harsh lesson in humility. Would Greg change his ways? Marcus didn't know, nor did he expect to find out. What mattered was that the truth had been laid bare, forcing everyone involved to confront uncomfortable realities. As he set his phone aside and leaned back in his chair, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of pride. These battles weren't easy, but they were necessary. Each one brought him closer to the world he believed in. A world where people were judged by their actions, not their appearances. And as he gazed out at the glittering cityscape, he reminded himself of the power of resilience, the importance of leading by example, and the enduring hope that even in the face of ignorance, progress was always possible. With that thought, Marcus closed his eyes, ready to rest before the next chapter of his journey began.